Alright guys, here we go. Part 5, the last installment of my great jazz guitar players. It's been quite the series. I've learned a lot myself. A lot of you seem to be enjoying it. I always hate as I go deeper into a series, the viewership goes down, you lose people, and it's tough because I work hard on these, but you can only keep people's interest so long. For those of you who stick through to the end, I appreciate that a lot. It is very appreciated because I definitely put a lot of time and effort into this. It kind of even distracts me from my listening. I don't have a lot of time to sit around and listen to records because I'm focused on taking notes and putting together things, and I don't want to be distracted by flipping sides. So it's definitely been a lot of work, and probably 3 weeks in the running now of putting it together and now shooting and editing it. But like I said, I've enjoyed it. It's been a great process for me as well. I've learned about some real guys that were the roots of the guitar that I didn't know much about. The Lonnie Johnson, is it? All those early guys. There was a lot I learned there as well. But a little fun piece I picked up in the mail today. This is a Chuck Wayne 10-inch from 1953 on the Progressive label, which is not a label I have a lot of stuff on. It's got George Duvivier, Ed Shaughnessy, Harvey Leonard, Brew Moore, and Zoot Sims. From all the reviews I've read of this record, though, it's not the best sounding, but it's still a cool piece. I didn't pay much for it, so I'm pretty happy to have that in the fold now. And then that Dick Garcia record I talked about in part 4 has an alternate cover. I also got this in the mail pretty cheap the other day. This is a message from Garcia. The original cover had that gal with the phone. For some reason, within the same year, they reissued it with this cover, which has like a battle scene on it. And I don't know why. It doesn't seem to make more sense. A message from Garcia. Maybe it's like the first cover is better, but it's just cool to have the second one. Again, it wasn't very expensive, so I thought I'd grab it just to show you guys, and it's the kind of collector that I am. So number 31 on this list is probably, from all the guitar players I know, the preeminent jazz guitarist, and that's Wes Montgomery. From personal friends of mine to friends who play overseas, just from all courts. If you play guitar, Wes Montgomery does things that you go, oh, that was cool. And I dabble in the guitar, but I'm more of a singer-songwriter. I'm not any kind of player in that sense. I was a drummer for a long time, and as a drummer, you actually don't really enjoy the virtuosos as much as you do the guys who just want to write a riff and a lick and get people's head nodding and feet tapping. Nothing worse than playing in a room full of people and no one's moving. And I try to apply that same concept to my DJing. If people aren't feeling it and ain't grooving, this isn't the right venue for that music. And so there's certain things I just don't think belong in the public realm, in a sense where you're trying to entertain people with them. And we need to be able to keep that distinction clear, that a lot of what I define as being good means it's accessible. It's still got jazz soul to it, but it's accessible. People will enjoy it. Wes Montgomery is just such a brilliant player. And I'm probably not the one to speak on it as well as some could, but he does single line notes. He does a lot of octave work. And then he often will use chords in a way that never had really been done before. My friend Chris Hagen has talked about some of his little backward stylings and this interesting little things he does that as a guitar player you're just like intrigued by how do you think of that. And it all seems fairly effortless to him and fairly just ho-hum in a way. And the greats often can do that. They often can make the impossible so effortless. Wes Montgomery was born in Indianapolis, March 6, 1923. He has two brothers, Buddy and Monk Montgomery, who were members of the Master Sounds, and Wes recorded with them off and on at times. In 43, he first heard Charlie Christian. So throughout this list, guys have always referenced Charlie Christian as being one of their primary driving forces and influences. He also likes to pluck the strings with his thumb. And I guess that came about from recording in an apartment or practicing in an apartment, not wanting to drive his neighbors crazy. Instead of using a pick, he would use his thumb to brush the strings and play quietly. And it became one of his innovations and something that people think Wes Montgomery now. It's a pretty cool innovation. He's an early modern jazz player. When he first starts recording, he's doing soul jazz in the West, kind of cool stuff. Comes to Riverside and ends up doing some fairly cool post-bop modern stuff into kind of soul jazz a little bit. And then he ends up doing kind of poppier jazz by the end at Verve, and actually kind of has some early indications of the fusion jazz that's going to come in the 70s. He heard Charlie Christian, like I said, in 43, and he went and bought a guitar the next day, which that's pretty cool. In 48, he plays with Lionel Hampton, had access to musicians like Mingus, Milt Buckner, and Fats Navarro. He doesn't want to fly or travel, so he ends up going back to Indianapolis, where he plays with Eddie Higgins, Walter Perkins, and Leroy Vinegar, who are all from that area. And so they have a little quartet going for a while. If you look at the VJ label, Eddie Higgins has a record there, and VJ is out of Indiana, and they're more closer to Chicago. But Higgins, Walter Perkins has stuff on VJ. Leroy Vinegar makes a record on VJ later on. In 57, he decides to go west. He works with Cannonball Adderley. Adderley brings him to the attention of Warren Keepnews at Riverside. And he comes to Riverside and he makes quite a pretty impactful splash. He actually does only 3 records as a sideman, and they're all at Riverside. One's with Cannonball Adderley called The Pole Winners. One's with Nat Adderley, I think it's Work Song. And then he does a record with Harold Land that I think's on the Jazzland side of Riverside. And he, like I said, he does some off and on stuff with his brothers, the Master Sounds. But for the most part, he's just making these great records at Riverside. And then when Creed Taylor and the Verve thing really starts taking off, Verve's always looking to pick talent from the smaller labels. And so Verve grabs Wes Montgomery and brings him over to Verve label. And it's just stuff that he does with Wynton Kelly there, smoking. That's just such a great record. Some of his stuff by 65, 66, California Dreamin' and Tequila are far more just pop crossover, light jazz. And it's a little bit of shame that that's where we end up seeing Wes. And then he goes with Creed Taylor on to A&M and makes 3 really great records there that are early elements of the fusion, rock, pop crossover that CTI became really renowned for. He wins a ton of polls for the guitar players in the 60s. And there's also a lot of tributes out there to Wes Montgomery from other guitar players. He's just, it's hard for me as a non-guitar player. Like I said, I dabble in guitar. I can write some chords and some songs, but I'm certainly not one of those guys that can just sit down and riff. And this guy, from every guitar player friend I've ever had, he's the one that they always say is the best. And I've probably said that before, but it's worth reiterating. And so probably Charlie Christian, Wes Montgomery, and then the guy we're going to end this video with, George Benson, are probably the 3 greatest players of jazz guitar in this era. You know, Christian's innovations are everywhere. Wes really innovates his own thing. And then George is such a brilliant player that encompasses so many different sounds and then really crosses over into the pop mainstream by the time he gets into his middle of his career. But we'll look at some Wes records here. This is one of his first at Riverside, 310. Fantastic stuff. This is one we're listening to right now with Tommy Flanagan, Percy Heath, and Albert Heath. Nice little record. I love this session. Fantastic. You know, he makes a lot. That's with his brothers. He makes a lot of records at Riverside. And it seems that by the end of the Riverside, when what's his name? Tripping my tongue. Bill Grauer. Bill Grauer at Riverside passes away. And the company turns out is in such turmoil that it's near bankruptcy. And Orrin Keepnews was kind of more of the music production side, the talent A&R guy, and Bill Grauer was supposed to be running the financial side of things, but Grauer didn't really turn out to know what he was doing, and so within a year of Bill Grauer's passing in '62, Riverside's filed for bankruptcy, and it seems as though what was still in the vaults, unreleased, rounds out the 400 series. Riverside Modern starts at 200, and Grauer passes around 420, 430. So about 230 records come out during that classic period. And there's a 10-inch period before that, and there's also some Dixieland stuff that gets on various imprints. So there's a lot of stuff going on with Riverside, subsidiary labels like Battle, and also, of course, the Jazzland sequence has another 100 records or so there. But it seems like after the closing of the label, they end up putting unreleased stuff in that later 400 sequence and just keep issuing stuff. And it's all great stuff. 494, 499. See, they're just really stuffing a lot of stuff. There's with George Shearing, who he works with quite a lot. Little puppy dog interruption there. He goes to, like I said, Verve in about 64, 65. And Moving West is a great record. This bumping record's outstanding. I don't care for some of the Don Sebesky arrangements, which is often the case. This is probably one of his best at Verve, smoking at the half note with Wynton Kelly. I think Paul Chambers and Jimmy Cobb round that out. It's fantastic stuff. Going out of my head. We start getting a little popular here with like Tequila and California Dreamin', but there's still good guitar. You know, and I actually as a DJ would play California Dreaming or Tequila, and the audience would tap their foot and just love it because it was very accessible. The white people sitting there having their brunch are always comfortable with the guitar, and so for them it wasn't like jazz. This was what jazz, oh, this is great, I love this. You know, so Creechella knew what he was doing. He knew who his audience was. This is Jimmy Smith with Wes Montgomery, the dynamic duo. That's a fantastic session. Just a greatest hits collection. Then this is stuff that comes out posthumously after he passes and leaves Verve. Willow Weep for Me, Eulogy, and Just Walking. So it's a pretty prolific body of work that he does at Verve. And then it's his 3 CTI titles. And these are all beautiful titles, beautiful covers. And they're a long ways from the music he was making a decade earlier at Riverside. You know, these are pop, art, landscape, sonic indulgences. And they're really elaborate, well produced, they sound immaculate. You still hear Wes had a lot of innovation left to come. And it would have been great to see where he had gone, but he dies from a heart attack too young, and we're left with kind of an unfulfilled legacy. But even in that short time, he makes an indelible imprint. And in some ways, I think we suffered with his legacy because of where he recorded, who he chose to record with. A lot of times he's in more of the white studio settings, not playing with a bunch of angry young black men, that's for sure, like a Blue Note. And so he's playing in a more commercial setting frequently. And I think in some ways it's diluted his reputation along a lot of some hardcore jazz fans. The Riverside titles, like I said, are fantastic. But the Verve stuff, it certainly is a more saccharine. But Wes had a lot of kids. I think he had 9 kids, if I recall. So he had bills to pay. And so we can never fault a man for getting his bills paid and taking care of his loved ones. After all, that does come first. So one of the greats, without any question. And you should never really pass up any Wes Montgomery. If you see his Riverside stuff, you should grab it. And it's worth 40, 50, 60 bucks plus. If you see the Verve stuff, I wouldn't pay more than 20 bucks for those, maybe 30 if it's in great condition. Same with the CTI. There's enough of those out there. They sold well enough. They don't have to be reissues. You can find nice original copies for a decent price. And I'm sure even on some of those records, the price is starting to go up, as with all jazz records at this point. But you can find those for good prices in the wild. Number 32 on my list, the great Jim Hall. And Jim Hall's a fantastic player. It's a little easy to get him confused with Joe Pass, to be honest. They kind of have similar careers. They kind of have similar balding dome pieces. And so one would be pardoned if they got Hall and Pass confused at times. Jim Hall, Joe Pass, they don't sound super different. Same syllabic kind of content. Similar labels and history in some ways as well. But Hall's a great player. Out of Buffalo, New York, December 4th, 1930. At the age of 13, he heard Charlie Christian on a Benny Goodman LP. He was awfully influenced by Charlie Parker, Lester Young, Paul Gonsalves, and Lucky Thompson. And so even though he heard Christian and could play Christian solos, he was much more interested in playing like the horn players, those single note long lines, and he wasn't as much of a chord guy. He played like the sax players. He goes to LA in 1956. He starts playing with Chico Hamilton, and they have a great West Coast sounding group at the time. And then he plays with Jimmy Joffrey in a similar group that again had some edges, some modernity, edges of the avant-garde even at times. He works with Ben Webster, Paul Desmond. He tours with Ella Fitzgerald. In 1960, he goes to New York, records with Lee Konitz. He records with Sonny Rollins on The Bridge, one of Rollins' masterpieces. He records with Art Farmer on Atlantic, which is a nice little session. He does studio work with Big Joe Turner, Johnny Hartman. He's fantastic on that Hartman record. June Christie, Frida Payne, plus four of the main arrangers of the day: Quincy Jones, Lalo Schifrin, Oliver Nelson, Gary McFarlane. You're really only missing Sebesky and Gil Evans in that crew. He can be heard with Rollins, Sonny Stitt, John Lewis, Nat Adderley. He's on with Bill Evans on Undercurrent. He's with John Lewis on the Jazz Abstractions. Both are really great records. In 1963, he starts working with the Merv Griffin Show, playing in that group. So again, a white guy given an opportunity in a TV film studio, being a card-carrying union guy. Those white guys certainly had a lot more opportunity to make a living. Hall's record here for Pacific 1227 is really a great session and worthy of finding for anyone. His record he does for CTI in about 75 with great players like Ron Carter, Chet Baker, Steve Gadd, Roland Hannon, and Paul Desmond. This Concerto record is absolutely a brilliant record. And this comes out much later. This is on the Concord label and looking very much like Someone's Uncle. And it would be hard not to confuse that with Joe Pass at a quick glance. Great stuff. And I'm growing in my love for Jim Hall, you know. And again, the Bridge kind of always made me love him. The record with Johnny Hartman, I've always kind of loved that. And I've been a fan of this for the few years that I've had it. But I'm starting to appreciate Jim Hall more and more. And he's a guy that everybody should pay attention to. But that's probably true for most of the cats on this list if you love jazz guitar. So the logical way to follow up Jim Hall would be with Joe Pass. Number 33 on my list. So we're getting near the end here. He's born June 13th, 1929 in New Brunswick, New Jersey, which is just south of the Newark in the Metroplex area of New York City, essentially. Works with Oscar Peterson and Ella Fitzgerald a lot, especially later at the Pablo label with Norman Granz. He moves to New York, does some work there, moves to New Orleans. He ends up doing a lot of heroin when he's down there and playing bebop for strippers is what he said. He spends a lot of time getting high, playing music, and chasing girls in that order. It was getting high first, and then it was about the music, and then it was about chasing tail. He ends up in jail, spends a number of years in rehab, sobering himself up, and he ends up leaving the scene, not really even playing guitar while he's gone. He returns in the mid-60s though, and Downbeat gives him the New Star Award when he comes back. While at Pacific Records, he works with Bud Shank, Gerald Wilson, Les McCann, and Groove Holmes. In the 60s, he ends up doing TV and session work. Again, White Cat's got that opportunity to them. Grands brings him in to the Pablo label in the 70s, where he records with a lot of great talent that Grands reaccrues at Pablo in the 70s. He looks like your uncle, one reviewer said, but he can tear up the guitar. He's a nimble player. He loves to play complex chords and just interesting arrangements. This is the For Django record on Pacific, number P85. Probably puts it at about 62 or 3, maybe even a little later. Because Pacific runs the 1200 series till probably about 5960, and then they relaunch with the number 1. And this would be number 85, so it's probably 64, 65 in there. And this was his first one that he did at Pacific P73. He shows up as a sideman before this, but these are his 2 first Pacific record titles. They're fantastic records. Again, a guy with a troubled past, and music was just such a powerful medicine, even for the white troubled mind. You know, it's such a solace for all of us as we go through the wilderness. Music is there for us. It's that friend that we all so need to holler at and rely on. So that's Jim Hall and Joe Pass, 2 guys that I dearly love and think deserve all the recognition in the world. Now, the guy that I'm sure a lot of you have been sitting here waiting for is the great Grant Green. And Grant Green's legacy has grown over the years, in no small part because of his affiliation with the Blue Note label. He's probably as popular as any guitar player at this point. It may be even a little overinflated, his place in the jazz guitar canon in some ways because of that Blue Note affiliation, but that's true for a lot of Blue Note artists. Blue Note just gets you that extra street cred. Grant Green was born in St. Louis, June 6, 1935. Again, he was inspired by Charlie Christian, but it was Bird that he wanted to play like, and thus he plays these long linear notes. He plays these long lines of guitar. He's not very interested in playing chords or rhythm, and he rarely did so unless he was a sideman. And his body work as a sideman is not that prolific. There's some, but again, he gets pretty initial success when he comes to Blue Note. Alfred was very impressed, and he gave him a session as a leader right off the bat. And the session actually got shelved and became later issued at 1980 as his first session. But he was nervous and he didn't really perform up to his standards. And actually don't have that first session record. I bet you Tone Polar will issue it at some point, and I will wait for that because I like those covers and they're beautifully packaged. But Grant could play hard bop, he could play bebop, he could play the blues, and he always had a lot of blues in him. He could also play soul jazz, and he's a big part of the soul jazz organ, guitar, crossover, and he had a lot of gospel influence in him as well. And I think sometimes he takes criticism from some people as being really basic and simplistic, and like just playing those single note lines where he's just playing these long Parker-like extensions of bebop. But that was what he wanted to be. That was how he felt. And I think Green, his greatest attribute is the fact that a lot of his stuff is brooding. It's moody. A lot of jazz guitar tends to be light and joyous and frisky and frivolous. A lot of Grant sessions have a weight to them, a darkness. And that was what attracted me to Grant Green a lot. Even Idle Moments, which is one of my favorite songs on the planet, it's a simple blues, but there's a dark depth to it. And Duke Pearson's piano just tingles down my spine like a haunting novel. It just has this endless movement of the 4 soloists on that song, each telling you a harrowing tale. And so Grant Green, in part because he's at Blue Note and getting other young black sidemen around him, it just all has a darker, denser, more clouded feel emotionally than most of what I hear in guitar jazz. And a lot of the black guys, like I said, are just kind of rhythm and blues guys. There's a few guys that are great, you know, but Wes gets pulled into the pop idiom. George Benson gets pulled into the pop idiom. Grant Green stays fairly much true to his blues and gospel and bebop roots until he comes back from a hiatus from Blue Note and drugs and kind of brings back an electric kind of funk fusion thing, but it's very much an R&B blues fusion electric sound. It's by no means that Bitches Brew complex arrangement. It's much more pocket driven, which I'm always going to be more of a fan of that. I want to be able to have people nodding their feet, nodding their heads and tapping their feet. And some of those Grant Green records from the late 60s, early 70s were actually sampled a lot by the early hip-hop guys because they do have a lot of great grooves and nice breaks in them. And so, of course, the samplers are going to sit back and go nuts with that. In the early 60s, he's Blue Note's most recorded player. Between his side work and his leadership work, 61 to 65, Grant Green is kind of ubiquitous at the Blue Note label. He won the Best New Star of 62 at Downbeat, so he did make a pretty big impact. Grant Green's records did sell fairly well. Probably not Jimmy Smith well, like in the late 50s, but those records did sell fairly well, and some of them had moderate R&B, jazz chart hits, jukebox singles that would entice people to go out and buy the record. Like I said, he got into heroin in the late 60s, 67, 69. He's working at Verve and a few other labels. He ends up coming back to Blue Note with that electric group. He does some side work with Jimmy Forrest, of course with Lou Donaldson, organ player Babyface Willette. He's featured on both of his Blue Notes. Stanley the Man Turrentine, Hank Mobley, Horace Parlan. The drummer Dave Bailey is on one of his great records. Jack McDuff and Sonny Red, and of course he will like Quebec as well a few times. So it's mostly Blue Note guys there as well. And so that's all part of that sense of communion that I've talked about at Blue Note. When you're a part of that stable, there's a social consciousness, there's a political awareness, there's a black awakening that these young black men are all intercommunicating and dialoguing about, and it's proliferating through the ranks. And so you can't help but record with these guys and rehearse with these guys, smoke cigarettes and break bread and have drinks without a lot of that social commentary becoming kind of a unanimous theme that we're all going to state when we go back to tracking. We might not even talk about doing such, but what we reflect and what we talk about in our emotional makeup is going to come back out when we start playing again. And so most Blue Note records will have a bit of urgency, and even these guitar records have a darkness and a social consciousness and a spirituality. I love Grant Green when he dives into the church and some of his gospel spiritual stuff. He does a Latin inflected record that's really kind of wonderful. But again, he's kind of a simple, basic player, but in some ways that's his strength. He's just playing what Parker told him to play. And so he's shying away from the rhythms and complexity, and he's just playing these long single note lines that crawl up and down your spine. I've been on record for saying I'm a huge Grant Green fan, and I absolutely am. There's a lot of other players out there that probably have a greater skill set, more virtuistic, but for my money, very few jazz guitar records punch me in my gut and make me feel something quite like the Grant Green discography. It's really fantastic. So what we got here is Grant Green's first stand, and this became his first record. And the slides are going to be here, so I'm just going to run through these rather quickly. Green Street, Grant Stand. This is Sunday Morning. The Latin bit. Feeling the Spirit. Am I Blue? Which I have a better copy of that right there. Idle Moments, which for me, like I said, is one of the great Blue Note records, guitar jazz records, records of any kind. That title track is just so wonderful. Talking About, which this is a Music Matters thing. I didn't get it because I liked Music Matters. I got it because it was the only way I could find this record. I think it's Music Matters. It's an expensive gatefold 245 LP. Yeah, I think it's Music Matters. But I got this 10 years ago, so they must have been around longer than I realized. I Want to Hold Your Hand, the Beatles, Impact, 4202. That's Green Street, Street of Dreams, sorry. Carrying On. And right about there is where he's kind of coming back from a hiatus where he was at Verve and a few other places. Green is Beautiful, did okay. Green Alive was a great record. Tribe Called Quest sampled that. This was sampled by a number of people as well. Visions. This is a great record, Shades of Green. The Final Come Down was a film soundtrack that he records and puts some interesting funk guitar. Born to Be Blue was a great session with Quebec Sonny Clark. And this is, of course, a Tone Poet reissue that was never officially issued. Here's an issue of Nigeria. Again, a Tone Poet with Sonny Clark and Sam Jones and Arthur Blakey. There's probably 3 or 4 more records by Grant Green that Tone Poet's going to put out in the next couple of years, I would be willing to bet. This is Oleo. There's another one called Matador, where he's playing with Coltrane's rhythm section, McCoy Tyner and Elvin Jones. This is a shittier reissue of Nigeria, which has been relegated now because of Grant Green. This is with Joe Henderson, James Spalding, McCoy Tyner, Elvin Jones. Solid. It's a more interesting record than some, and why this wasn't given a better cover. And I think there has been a Music Matters reissue of that I don't have the money to buy. Main attraction, Grant Green here. This is on the Kudu label with Hubert Laws, and the title track on this is a fantastic long blues funk jam that I really enjoy. This is just an interesting 2-record set for DJs. That's some of his acoustic stuff and some of his funkier stuff. That's great to bring to a DJ gig. This is his Verve album, His Majesty. And I've had a couple different copies of this, and they've always had a bit of a hiss to them, which is disappointing. And then this is Last Session. And then this came a little earlier, Walk in the Night. This is Grant Green live at the Lighthouse, if I recall. And there's a couple of Walk in the Night tracks, pretty legendary. It's going to be one of the last songs on my playlist when we get to that. So that wraps up Grant Green, truly one of the giants. And I think when you recognize what he does and why he does it, and the darkness and the brooding nature of it, it's probably the darkest jazz guitar out there. And that has a place and a value in and of itself. That brooding, melancholic, somber experience that Grant Green gives me, I value that. So a guy that's kind of rooted in the blues, and it's hard really to extricate what he does from the blues, but these are kind of jazzy exercises for him, is a guy by the name of Mel Brown. And he makes about 4 or 5 records for Impulse starting in 65, 66. This is the only one I have at this point. I'll probably try to grab the other ones, that Chicken Fat, I think it's called. I've always wanted to kind of missed it at auction. But he's a fun player, very rooted in the blues. He was born in Jackson, Mississippi. He makes his name kind of playing in Bobby Blue Bland's band for about a decade. In 55, he's actually playing with Sonny Boy Williamson backing him, the great harp player. He plays with Johnny Otis. He plays with Etta James, all kind of bluesy, jazzy crossovers. And Bob Thiel, who was at Impulse at that point, brings him in to record in 65. He makes Chicken Fat, this Wizard album, and a few more albums going into the 50s. Want to Suck My Thumb with his kid on the cover. He plays with B.B. King. He plays with John Lee Hooker. He plays with Lightning Hopkins. So he's got quite a blues pedigree, but he also plays some jazz, organ, combo stuff here at Impulse that's fairly intriguing, and it's got a lot of guts, a lot of black neighborhood feel to it. I think you could get away with playing Mel Brown at a black barbecue or a church picnic, and you get a lot of people going, "Where's my tambourine?" You know what I mean? It's got that guts to it, and that just that feeling, you know. And obviously, feeling is what music and art are all about. What's it make you feel? So I'm not an expert on Mel Brown, but I've had this record now for probably a year and a half. I've listened to it maybe 3 times, and every time I've been like, wow. I need to get more of his stuff, but then I forget, in part because I have the first 150 impulses, and then about 30 or 40 more after 150, but there's not a lot in impulse that I'm looking for. I have that first chunk finished, and a lot of what comes after that is very much the avant-garde, and so I've shied away from buying a lot of impulses, which means I don't think to search impulses when I'm buying records. I don't search a guy's store and go, let's see what other impulses he's got, because I'm not really looking for them, and I forget to look for Mel Brown. It's something I need to fix at some point, is pick up a few more of his impulse titles, because they're really outstanding. And like I said, he's a Jackson, Mississippi, Lobby Blue Band. He's got the pedigree that makes him very much a jazz blues guy, and worth looking for. So we're into our last 5 now, and a guy that's kind of under the radar, and most of you probably won't be too familiar with, this guy by the name of Bill Harris. He makes 2 great records at Emercy, and he plays acoustic guitar again, which is a bit of a almost novelty at this point in jazz. This is probably 57, 58, he makes those 2 records, and he makes his name as an R&B guitar player with the Clovers, who make a lot of great records at Atlantic, and Atlantic's really leading the pack with their R&B in the late 50s and in the early 60s, of course. But Harris was a great player and didn't want to be just limited to playing R&B, and so he gets these 2 jazz sessions. He plays the acoustic guitar, and it's just a beautiful sound. Has a lot of interesting inflections and just narrations of what he's doing. He was born Nashville, North Carolina, so not Nashville, Tennessee, Nashville, Carolina, on August 14th, 1925. He studies guitar in D.C. He joins the Clovers, plays R&B with them until about 58. He records for Emercy at the same time, 56, 57, when he makes these 2 records. In the D.C. area, he taught music. He published a bunch of books on guitar. He ends up getting the fellowship for the National Endowment of Arts, just because he's a real instrumental person in the teaching and the passing on of the knowledge. There's not a lot of information to be had on Bill Harris. You know, these 2 records, you'll find them for probably under $10 on Emercy. This one has a slight Emercy peel going on, which, if you know Emercy, they're pretty famous for that. But I really enjoy this album especially. I think it's solo guitar all the way through, but he really knows how to carry it. He knows how to add color and kind of shifting sounds and rhythms that really make the album work. And it's something you can find for a great price. Emercy 36097. And that first 100 Emercies come out fast and furious. From 35 to 57, they release 55 to 57. They issue 100 records, so it's pretty prolific. Another fabulous player is Pat Martino, and Pat Martino was born August 25, 1944, in Philadelphia, and that's going to obviously lead him to being part of that Philly organ guitar sound that's kind of dominating the black neighborhoods in Philadelphia. And we discussed in some other players last episode that huge development of the guitar organ duality. Grant Green's a part of it, Jimmy Smith is a part of it, Jack McDuff's a part of it. It just seems like guitar and organ are very interlinked, especially once we reach the 1960s. He's a kind of a young prodigy. He turns pro at the age of 15. He lives with Les Paul for a while. I can't imagine that didn't make an impact on him. For a while, he's playing at Small's Paradise in Philadelphia 6 months of the year, and then in the summer he's playing in Atlantic City during the tourist seasons, making some money over there. He records with Lloyd Price, Willis Jackson, of course, at Prestige, Eric Close at Prestige. He plays with organist Charles Erland, Groove Holmes, Jack McDuff, Jimmy Smith, Don Patterson, and Joey DeFrancesco, and a few others as well. So he's got a long history of playing with the organ guys. He wins all kind of awards in the late 60s, early 70s. Sadly, he suffers from a brain aneurysm in 1980. And it doesn't kill him, but he completely forgets how to play guitar, 100%. So he has to kind of relearn, which I guess he's able to do and continue on. This is early Prestige for him, 75-13, so probably about 1967, if I'm guessing. It's an OJC pressing, 1967. He's a great player. You know, I only have 2 records of his. This is another one on Prestige shortly after, 75-47. So those come pretty close together, probably 67, maybe 1968. But Pat Martino's a guy definitely worthy of you noticing him. You know, I'm sure a lot of guys who like soul jazz and organ jazz are well aware of Pat Martino. I'm going to grab more of his stuff as I start buying more 70s stuff. At some point, I'm probably going to have to, because I've finished off so much of the 50s and 60s labels. It's time to see some of that stuff coming up forward in the rearview mirror, what's happening. But again, I like what I like. I love what I love. And there's just a feeling I get from the late 50s, early 60s that's so magical to me. And it's hard to replicate by some virtuoso who has a great education but doesn't have the struggle to relate that same kind of feeling of desperation. And for me, the most powerful thing music can teach me is hope in the face of desperation. Like, there's nothing I get from music more empowering. That's my religious experience. And so when music lacks that, it doesn't move me. And so that's the entire philosophy behind what I say a lot of the time, is I get moved by that era's music because it had a social power to it. And it was people in great struggle finding freedom in that art. And it just medicates me in my dark times, in my dark moods, in my tough times, when money's tight, when there's stress going on. Remembering the sacrifice and the power of what the art gave these men, it just gives me a certain sense of relief, and that's where the magic lies for me. At number 38 is Gabor Szabo, a Hungarian immigrant to America who kind of comes into the limelight around the hippie movement era. So a lot of his stuff got associated with that psychedelic rock and feedback, and it's partly why I came to Gabor Szabo as early as I did in my musical journey. I was coming from the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane and Jimi Hendrix and a lot of the psych stuff that was happening in the late mid-60s, and Gabor Szabo just kind of really transcended right into that same feel. You felt like you could be at a hippie drum circle with Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and then all of a sudden Gabor Szabo would be playing. He's a gypsy. He's got a certain amount of Eastern European mysticism that he absolutely kind of takes the full advantage in his image and his sound. You know what I mean? He's well aware that even as an American that I've been living here now for a while, there's a certain amount of value in me leaving that ethnic kind of cultural aspect to what I'm doing. He definitely was a guy that white kids bought, not so much the brothers. Gabor was born March 8, 1936 in Hungary, in Budapest. At the age of 14, he starts playing guitar. He moves from Hungary. He moves to California in 1956 because of the revolution that was happening with the Soviet incursions into Hungary. He goes to Berkeley from 58 to 60. In 61, he starts playing with Chico Hamilton. And they start doing that chamber jazz with Charles Lloyd. It's moderate avant-garde at times. You know, I mean, it's not screaming, squelching, but there's certainly edges and dissonance in some of what they're doing. He's influenced by rock and by feedback and by the hippie community. Gypsy Queen from this record was a hit for Carlos Santana when he covers it. He ends up forming the Sky label with Cal Jader and Gary McFarland, and they make some interesting titles on that label as well. I'll flip through his titles here real quick. Sorcerer, The Rambler on CTI. This was on the Sky label, Bacchanal. Ms. Rob, his original version of Ms. Rob is fantastic. That's just a collection. A lot of Impulse work, another greatest hits collection. Wind, Sky, and Diamonds. This is with Gary McFarland, Jazz Raga, Spellbinder, Simpatico, Gypsy 66. So if you like campfire-esque guitar, that's kind of light, but again, the guy's still seen struggle. You know what I mean? He had to escape Hungary during an ugly time, probably saw some poverty, a lot of political division, and he came to California during the hippie movement, and there was a liberalism and excitement that was happening on the on the West Coast at that time. So I've always enjoyed his records, although I don't play them now like I once did. Partly because my palate keeps changing and growing, partly because I'm always trying to learn and hear new things. Having this channel makes me keep having to branch out and find new art, listen to records I haven't listened to or dug out in a while. So I don't just get to sit back and listen to old favorites very often. I already know this stuff pretty good, and so I don't need to listen to it a bunch to speak on it. And I try not to speak on stuff too much I haven't listened to, which is partly why I don't delve into some of the later stuff much. I'd be phony if I sat here to start talking about John Scofield and Mahavishnu Orchestra and John McLaughlin. I tried to listen to that Birds of Prey record. I wanted to include it, and I couldn't stand it. It's absolutely awful. The guitar tones are just screeching fingernails on a pie plate. I couldn't fathom how people think that's brilliant. It was absolutely awful to me. I went 2 different times to try to play it and find something I liked. And there was a couple songs I didn't hate, but for the most part, most songs descended into something that I just want nothing to do with. My ears were like, please, cut me off. I don't want to hear this shit. So, and I don't want to be critical too much. I try not to anymore. I've had some people say I shouldn't do that as much as I do, so I've been trying to cut back on that. But I'm just being honest. I wanted to include it. He's an important guy. But guitar jazz that makes me think of dragons and sea breezes and whatever the heck you got, it just feels different to me, that later stuff. So I'm going to move on. Another Hungarian by the name of Attila Zoller is number 39 on my list. And my friend Wolfgang Pointner is a big fan of Attila Zoller. He's the one who first kind of turned me on to him. I then realized I had some of his side work already. But if I recall, he was actually taught by Attila Zoller in New York for a while. And he has high things to say about Attila. Also born in Hungary in the village of Visegrad, June 13, 1927. After the war, the Soviet control starts coming in, and he ends up crossing the Alps into Austria on foot with his guitar. So that right there gives you some depth of character. In 1959, he moved to the USA to become a music teacher. He was taught violin as a child by his father. He actually moves to Germany for a while in the 50s and plays with Jutta Hipp and a few others. People touring Germany like Oscar Petterford and Lee Konitz told him he should move to the USA, which he of course ends up doing. And when he goes to America, he ends up going to a college of jazz, like Lenox School of Jazz. He's taught by Jim Hall for a while, and he actually rooms with a guy by the name of Ornette Coleman, some of you might have heard of, who was of course the progenitor of the free jazz movement. He plays with Herbie Mann, Benny Goodman, Stan Getz, Red Norvo, Jimmy Rainey, Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, Shirley Scott, Cal Tjader, and even Jimi Hendrix. And I did a little quick research and I couldn't find where. I didn't look very hard because I got a lot of things going on here. But he's a great little player. He's not in the gypsy vibe like Gabor Szabo was. He's more of a traditional jazz, modern player. Again, a very important instructional guy. And from what my friend Wolfgang has told me, he's turned down career opportunities that would probably have been lucrative and commercial because that wasn't what he wanted to be. So he probably could have been a much bigger name had that been on his forecast, but it wasn't what he wanted to ever really do. So this is Attila Zoller, Gypsy Cry, on the Embryo label. I think it's from the late 60s, maybe even early 70s. 1970. Lou Tabakin's on this, Victor Gaskin, Sonny Brown, Herbie Hancock's actually on this as well. Reggie Workman is on a couple of the tracks. So there's some definitely great jazz pedigree on here. I'll probably pick up more of his records as I see them. I don't see them a ton, if I'm honest. But Attila Zoller, number 39, and that leads us to number 40, the great George Benson. Number 40, George Benson. And he is one of the greatest guitar virtuosos of all time in any genre. He can play in almost any style you want. He's a fantastic rhythm and blues guy, an equally gifted singer, it turned out. Not something he did initially in his career, but when he starts singing Masquerade and some of those songs he does, Give Me the Night was a huge hit in the late 70s with Quincy Jones. He's really a prolific guy and an incredible talent. He's born in Pittsburgh in March 22nd of 1943. He lives in the Hillside District, which is a very poor black neighborhood. There's actually a great documentary out there about the Pittsburgh jazz scene and talks a lot about the Hill District, something you should all check out. He turns pro at a young age. He's a child prodigy. At 19, he's already professional. 8 years old, he's playing in an illegal jazz club that ends up getting shut down by the police. At the age of 9, he's already recorded his first sessions, and 2 of the tracks come out as a 45. And I don't think they're very easy to come by. But he ends up struggling in school because he's doing so much work. His guitar ends up getting confiscated from him. His dad eventually builds him a new one, thank goodness. He loves Hank Garland, the guy we talked about back in episode 1 or 2. At the age of 21, he releases a new Boss guitar on Prestige, is what we're listening to here. And this is a pretty traditional jazz record with George Benson, Jack McDuff, Red Holloway's on the tenor sax, Ronnie Boykins and Montego Joe is on the drums. Young guy, but he's already got all the soul. And of course, the poverty of being in Pittsburgh was all the fuel that young George Benson needed. When you have that desperation, it fuels your rehearsal time. It fuels your emptiness, your longing. You fill it with rehearsal. You just fill it with practice because it's a place of safety, a place of comfort. And he just became such a prolific player with beautiful voicings, great tones. He gets signed to Columbia pretty much early on after that Prestige record. He does 2 records at Columbia pretty early as a 19, 20-year-old. And these are both outstanding records, Cookbook and Uptown. And for Columbia to have signed him that early in his career, that tells you something about him. Then Verve signs him. He does a couple records for the Verve label, 8749 and 8771. So it puts these probably 68 or so towards the end of the great Verve run. And these are both great records as well, Giblet Gravy and The Goodies. Fun records I played at my gigs quite a lot. And then it's on to CTI. And it's with Creed Taylor at CTI that he just makes such an impact. And he makes great record after great record. White Rabbit, the cover of the Jefferson Airplane, Great Society track, Body Talk, Take 5, which is a reissue, Good King Bad, great record, Benson and Joe Farrell, fantastic. On the A&M CTI, Shape of Things to Come, George Benson, Tell It Like It Is, Benson, Bad Benson. This is the other side of Abbey Road, where he does great versions of the Beatles' Abbey Road. This is a more poppy mid-70s record with Masquerade and Breezin'. And for my money, Breezin's one of the great fusion R&B crossover hits of all time. By this point, he's pretty much just straight R&B pop star with Quincy Jones. Give Me the Night Will Rock, a room full of middle-aged folks like you won't believe. Weekend in LA is just a live record, but it's good. This is just a collection, George Benson. Beyond the Blue Horizon, it's another girly CTI record that's really good. And then, of course, just another copy of Bad Benson. I ended up with 2 of that one. So Benson's work is prolific, and it continues much beyond this, more on the R&B side of things. And as I've said to you people before, to the black community in their 50s and their 60s, this is what they think of when they think of jazz. They don't think about Thelonious Monk or Miles Davis even. They think of Grover Washington. They think of George Benson. They think of Donald Byrds, the Blackbirds. That was what they thought jazz, that they knew. It hit the radio. It hit the 45 jukeboxes. They could dance to it. It had jazz players from Jazz Roots, but the beats and the grooves were very much rhythm and blues. And again, as I've said before, jazz doesn't die per se. It just fuses itself back into the charts of rhythm and blues. And all those frayed ends of avant-garde and free and modal and all the things that happened in the 60s, those things end up in nowhere land with no audience, no large label recognition, and they're very much adulated today because the stuff's rare and hard to find, but it doesn't make it essential or a big part of the jazz canon. Because it's just not in perspective. And when you look at it and really are honest, a lot of that stuff's so peripheral, and it belongs there. It's niche. It's not really meant to access more than a few people. A lot of it's very self-indulgent. Benson's not that. Benson's very much an accessible, brilliant player. Tonality, his virtuosity, his feeling, his groove, his blues, even a bit of soul and gospel. It's all so culminated in this one place in George Benson. And so everything we've seen from those early players into Charlie Christian and that next wave, into the soul jazz movement, all the way through Wes Montgomery and Grant Green, George Benson's like this great culmination of all of that. And then, in a lot of ways, the black jazz guitarist goes extinct. And all the greats of guitar after this are your Metheny's, your Schofields, your Demiolas, McLaughlin's, all great players, all virtuosos. But its links to the blues and the black church and gospel are missing. And for my ears, is driven very much by virtuosity and intellect, which is associated with ego. Some people like it more than others. More power to you if you do. I'm not saying you shouldn't. If you love it, great. But for me, in my taste, it's Christian to Benson. That's the hierarchy and the culmination of what the guitar really is about. And Benson is the pinnacle. He's this last stand. And of course, he grafts himself into rhythm and blues and the pop charts and allows a whole new generation of blacks to still hear jazz, because when you would see Benson live, there would be moments when they would play very jazzy stuff. Or you would dig back and you'd find Benson's old jazz records. So Benson's this incredible link between a black audience who had left jazz and the younger generation of 30, 40-year-olds today who their idea of jazz is George Benson. And that wraps the series up. And next will come playlist number 1. I think I'm going to do the melancholy down-tempo playlist first, and then we'll do more up-tempo bright playlist second. They'll probably be 3 or 4 days apart to space them out. And from everybody I've talked to, I'm just going to let y'all download the tracks yourself, or make a Spotify or whatever playlist on whatever you want to use, because everyone has so many different things. I'm just going to make the list, play little tidbits, and then you guys can put the list together if you so choose. So thanks for all those who stayed tuned through all 5 parts. I hope you've all enjoyed it and learned as much as I have. Thank you for supporting the channel, and share it with your friends who love music. We try to be real, honest, and integral here and speak from the heart. Not everything I'm going to say is always going to be popular, but I'm not really here to be popular. I'm here to speak about the nuts and the bolts and the guts and the feelings of the music, not be top 10 list. And a top 10 list is fun, and I'll always be sucked into them too. But some channels are just so reaching for people, and I try to go a little more in depth, at least sometimes. So y'all stay tuned. If you want to support the channel, go to Patreon. Throw me a few bucks every month there. If not, you can go to the Teespring Jazz Shepherd merchandise in the link and buy some of the great Jazz Shepherd merchandise that we have out there. If not, you just want to watch the channel and learn about jazz and music, you're always, of course, welcome to do that, because the music is what comes first. So love you all. Be safe. Check out those playlists when they come out. Talk to y'all soon. Peace.